welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling one of history's most epic showdowns, a moment that really echoes down the centuries. The Spanish Armada of 1588.
It's a huge story, absolutely, and we're going to try and peel back some of the myths surrounding it. This was the largest engagement of the undeclared Anglo-Spanish War, a conflict stretching nearly 2 decades.
And the Spanish had this incredible name for the fleet, didn't they? The Grande y Felicísima Armada.
The great and most fortunate navy. Tells you something about their mindset going in, doesn't it? Almost a certainty of divine backing.
But fortune, well, it didn't quite play out that way. Our mission today, in part 1, is to really get under the skin of why this happened, the politics, the religion, the personalities, and the planning, or maybe the misplanning.
Precisely. This wasn't just about naval tactics. King Philip II of Spain saw this as a crusade. The orders he gave were crystal clear. Sail up the Channel, link up with the Duke of Parma's army waiting in Flanders.
A massive battle-hardened army.
Huge! And the Armada's job was basically to ferry them across the Strait of Dover to invade England, the aims. Overthrow Queen Elizabeth I, put Catholicism back in charge, stop English meddling in the Netherlands.
And stop those English privateers, the Sea Dogs, from raiding Spanish treasure ships. That was a big one, wasn't it?
Absolutely ruinous for the Spanish treasury. So yeah, it was total regime change they were after.
Okay, so before we even get to the ships clashing, we need to understand the world that led to this. Europe in the late 16th century. It was a tinderbox, really.
It absolutely was. And the relationship between Spain and England hadn't always been this hostile. You have to go back a bit.
Right.
For a good chunk of the previous decades, Spain and England were actually allies, their common enemy, France. Think Henry VII and Ferdinand II, that sort of era.
An alliance of convenience against the bigger continental power.
Exactly. But by Philip II's time, that whole picture had changed dramatically. The French wars of religion weakened France, and Habsburg Spain, Spain was the undisputed superpower.
We're talking a global empire, aren't we? Stretching from the Americas to the Philippines.
And then in 1580, Philip annexed Portugal, creating the Iberian Union. His empire was immense, truly the empire upon which the sun never set.
And how he managed it all is key, you mentioned.
Yes, because it speaks to the rigidity that would later hamper the Armada. Philip ruled from the Escorial Palace, this sort of monastic administrative hub near Madrid. Decisions came via written decree, inflexible instructions sent across vast distances. No quick adjustments possible.
Contrast that with England. Still a relatively minor player on the world stage.
Oh, very much so. Less influential, certainly less wealthy. And internally, it was still dealing with the fallout of the English Reformation under Henry VIII and Edward VI, which had pushed it towards Protestantism.
Which brings us to Mary I, Elizabeth's predecessor, Henry's Catholic daughter.
Right. Her marriage to Philip II himself temporarily brought England back into the Catholic fold. That period, Bloody Mary, saw intense persecution of Protestants.
And a disastrous war alongside Spain against France.
Crucially, yes, England lost Calais in 1558, its last foothold on the continent held for centuries. A massive blow to prestige and, critically, to the economy.
Losing Calais meant losing vital trade revenues, didn't it? Like the Antwerp cloth trade.
Exactly. It weakened England significantly, just as Spain's power in the Low Countries was consolidating. It really exposed England's vulnerability. Hashtag 1.2, the heretic queen, and the threat of the Catholic claimant.
So then, 1558, Mary dies, Elizabeth takes the throne, and she immediately starts putting Protestant reforms back in place.
Which, from Philip's perspective, was completely unacceptable. He'd been King of England alongside Mary. Now, his former kingdom was ruled by someone the Catholic Church considered illegitimate because they never recognized Henry VIII's divorce and a heretic besides.
So the religious divide is fundamental. But then there's the personal and political threat, too. Philip actively supported plots against Elizabeth, didn't he?
Constantly. The aim was always to replace her with her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Even after Mary was imprisoned in England from 1567 onwards, the plotting continued. The Babington plot being the most famous, perhaps the final straw.
Because Elizabeth's reaction to that was decisive.
Extremely. 2 key things happened. First, she finally signed Mary's death warrant. Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed in February 1587. That removed the main Catholic claimant, the figurehead for rebellion.
And second,
she significantly ramped up support for the Dutch rebels fighting against Spanish rule in the Netherlands. It was basically an open declaration of hostilities. The gloves were well and truly off.
And alongside all this political maneuvering, you have the Sea Dogs, Francis Drake and the others.
Ah, yes, the privateers. Elizabeth essentially licensed them to wage war on Spanish commerce. Drake's raids on Spanish ports and treasure fleets weren't just minor irritations, they were crippling blows to Philip's finances.
Stealing the silver needed to pay his armies in Flanders.
Precisely. It was state-sponsored piracy on a grand scale, and it infuriated Philip. It wasn't just theft, it was an insult to his power, a direct challenge. Hashtag Fotown 1.3, the Enterprise of England is formed.
So, putting it all together, the religious drive, revenge for Mary, Queen of Scots, stopping the Dutch support, ending the piracy. This is why Philip finally decides on invasion.
Well, it's a convergence of all those factors. He wanted religious freedom for English Catholics, compensation for the raid damages, or ideally a complete overthrow and Catholic restoration. And the Pope, Sixtus V, gave it his blessing, framing it as a crusade.
He even promised money, right? A subsidy.
A huge one. But there was a catch. Philip only got the money after his troops successfully landed on English soil. A bit of papal caution, perhaps.
The initial invasion plans were ambitious, to say the least.
Fantastical, almost. The Marquis of Santa Cruz, a very experienced admiral, first proposed a plan back in 1583. It involved something like 550 ships and nearly 100,000 men.
Which was just completely unrealistic.
Way beyond Spain's resources, vast as they were. Philip eventually settled on the more realistic plan. The main fleet sails from Spain, meets Parma's army in Flanders, and escorts it across. Still a colossal undertaking, mind you.
But even that plan hit a snag almost immediately. Drake's raid on Cadiz in 1587.
The singeing the King of Spain's beard, as Drake famously put it. It was a brilliant preemptive strike. He didn't stop the Armada altogether, but he caused chaos.
Destroyed supplies, ships.
Around 30 ships captured or destroyed, yes. But crucially, huge quantities of supplies, especially seasoned barrel staves needed for food and water casks. Losing those meant they had to use green wood later, which led to provisions spoiling much faster.
So that raid delayed the whole thing.
By at least a year. It forced the Armada to sail in 1588, a year late, with rushed preparations and suspect supplies. The timing right from the start was already looking shaky.
Okay, so the decision is made, the plan is set, albeit delayed. But assembling this great and most fortunate navy was proving anything but fortunate.
It was a logistical nightmare. And then a major blow right before they were due to sail. The designated commander, the experienced Marquis of Santa Cruz, died suddenly in February 1588.
Leaving a huge vacuum in command. Who did Philip choose?
He appointed Alonso de Guzman, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a very high-ranking nobleman, competent administrator, decent soldier, but with absolutely zero naval command experience.
Zero. For the largest fleet ever assembled.
Zero. He apparently hated the sea, got seasick. He actually wrote to Philip, pointing out his lack of experience, the problems with the ships, the supplies, basically begging off.
And Philip.
Well, the story goes that courtiers intercepted the letter. They didn't want anything delaying the enterprise of England. They supposedly assured Philip that God was on their side, that divine providence would ensure success, regardless of the commander's experience.
Wow. That speaks volumes about the atmosphere at court. Overconfidence, wishful thinking.
A dangerous mix of both, it seems. And this disconnect from reality wasn't just at the top. You look at the land commander, the Duke of Parma over in Flanders.
A brilliant general, by all accounts.
Absolutely. But he was deeply pessimistic about the plan. He kept stressing two things needed for success: absolute secrecy.
Which was already blown after the Cadiz raid and the general preparations.
Completely blown. And second, Parma needed secure passage across the channel for his troops. He needed the Armada to guarantee that. Hashtag 2.2, the flawed coordination plan.
And this is where the plan starts to look really flawed, isn't it? The idea was for the Armada warships to essentially act as convoy protection.
Exactly. Protecting hundreds of small, unarmed transport barges that would carry Parma's army from the Flemish coast across to Kent, probably near London.
But there was a massive problem with that. Parma's army couldn't actually get out to meet the Armada, could they?
No. That's the critical, fatal flaw. Parma's invasion barges were stuck in the shallow coastal waters and estuaries around Dunkirk and Newport, and patrolling those waters was a Dutch fleet.
The Dutch flyboats.
About 30 of them, under Justinus van Nassau. These were shallow draft, highly maneuverable vessels, perfect for coastal work. The huge, deep draft Spanish galleons of the Armada simply couldn't get into those shallow waters to clear them out.
So Parma was effectively blockaded by the Dutch.
Completely blockaded.
Yeah.
And the communication breakdown here is staggering. Medina Sidonia seems to have sailed believing Parma could just sortie out when the Armada arrived.
Parma knew he couldn't.
Parma had repeatedly told Philip that he couldn't move until the Armada had dealt with the Dutch blockade first. But the Armada couldn't deal with the blockade because of the shallow water. It was a strategic catch-22.
Unbelievable. So despite all these issues, command, coordination, supplies, the fleet eventually set sail. How big was it by then?
Around 141 ships left Lisbon initially in May-June 1588, though storms forced them back for repairs. When they finally left A Coruña in July for the Channel, it was closer to 137, and maybe 122 were considered frontline combatants or key support. Still huge.
And the manpower.
Over 29,000 men packed aboard. About 10,000 sailors, but nearly 19,000 soldiers infantry ready for the invasion. But here's another weakness. Less than half the ships were purpose-built warships. Many were converted merchantmen, slow, clumsy supply hulks.
How did that compare to the English fleet waiting for them?
The English had fewer truly large ships, maybe 226 vessels in total mobilized, but only 34 were Queen's ships, the core of the Royal Navy. The rest were smaller private vessels, armed merchantmen.
But the English ships were different, weren't they? More modern. Hashtag Tag 2.3, first fault lines emerge.
Radically different in concept. The English, under Hawkins particularly, had been developing these race-built galleons. They were longer, lower in the water, faster, much more maneuverable. Crucially, they were designed as gun platforms, built to stand off and fire cannons, not necessarily to close and board.
So less floating castles, more mobile artillery.
Exactly, and commanded by experienced seamen like Lord Howard of Effingham, the Lord High Admiral, plus Drake, Hawkins, Frobisher veterans of Atlantic sailing and raiding.
And even getting to the Channel was an ordeal for the Spanish.
Oh, yes. Severe storms in the Bay of Biscay battered the fleet right after leaving Lisbon. They had to put into A Coruña in northern Spain for weeks for repairs and resupply. More delays, more spoiled food, dwindling water supplies. Morale was already suffering before they even sighted England.
So finally, late July 1588, they're spotted off the Lizard in Cornwall. Beacons are lit.
The warning spreads like wildfire up the coast towards London. The great and most fortunate Navy has arrived.
But it's already weakened, poorly supplied, led by an inexperienced admiral, and committed to a fundamentally flawed plan. The English are waiting.
And crucially, the English understand the sea, the winds, and their own ships' capabilities in a way the Spanish High Command perhaps did not fully grasp. The stage is set for the clash in the Channel.
Okay, so the Armada is sighted. This massive crescent formation sailing up the Channel. It must have been an awe-inspiring, terrifying sight.
Absolutely. Imagine seeing that appear over the horizon. The Spanish held a council of war. What's the first move? Some of the experienced captains argued strongly for attacking the English fleet while it was still bottled up in Plymouth Harbor by the tide.
The traditional approach, catch them at anchor.
Exactly. A potentially decisive blow right at the start. But Medina Sidonia, possibly feeling the immense weight of Philip's very specific orders.
Orders which were just get to Palma.
Essentially, yes. Sail east, rendezvous with Parma. He overruled his captains and decided to stick rigidly to the plan. No diversion to Plymouth.
A missed opportunity.
Arguably a huge one, because as the tide turned, the English fleet, about 55 ships initially, managed to slip out of Plymouth. And crucially, they worked their way upwind of the Armada.
Gaining the weather gauge. Why was that so important?
It meant that English had the advantage of the wind. They could choose when and where to engage, and they could stay out of the Spanish ship's preferred close-quarter boarding range. They could dictate the terms of the battle.
And their first engagement off Plymouth on July 31st showed this new English tactic.
Yes. The English ships darted in, fired their cannons from a distance, and then sailed away before the Spanish could close. They deliberately avoided the grappling and boarding the Spanish wanted.
Hammering the Spanish formation without getting drawn into a melee.
Right. The Spanish formation, this defensive crescent, was designed to protect the vulnerable transports in the middle. It was formidable, but the English tactic was to harass, wear it down, cause confusion, rather than seek a single, decisive deck-to-deck battle.
How effective were the English cannons at this stage?
Initially, the range was often too great for major damage. No ships were sunk in these first encounters, but the constant cannonades were psychologically wearing, and the English gunnery was generally faster. Spanish cannons were often heavier, but slower to reload, partly due to ship design guns packed closely together, decks often cluttered with soldiers and supplies. The English emphasized trained gun crews and better gun carriages. Hashtag 3.2 captures and strategic setbacks.
So the Armada continues its slow procession up the Channel, constantly harassed. But then came some significant losses for Spain, not directly from enemy fire.
Yes, accidents played a huge part. Off Portland Bill, there was more fighting. The Spanish briefly gained the weather gauge, but the nimbler English ships outmaneuvered them. Then disaster struck the Spanish rear.
The Rosario.
The Nuestra Señora del Rosario, flagship of Pedro de Valdez. It collided with another Spanish ship, lost its mast, and was left crippled, drifting behind the main fleet.
And Drake snapped it up.
Drake captured it, yes. A huge prize, not just the ship and a senior commander, but also the Armada's main payroll, supposedly 50,000 gold ducats, and a vital store of gunpowder, which the English were already running low on.
A double blow loss for Spain, gain for England.
Yeah.
And wasn't there another major incident soon after?
Yes, the San Salvador. A massive explosion in its rear powder magazine. Sabotage was suspected, but it could have been accidental. The ship was shattered on fire.
Also captured.
The Spanish managed to evacuate most of the crew, but the burning hulk was eventually taken by the English. 2 major warships lost in quick succession, largely through accident and misfortune. It must have damaged Spanish morale.
Definitely. And this constant pressure, these losses, it affected Medina Sidonia's plans, didn't it? He'd hoped to anchor somewhere.
He had considered anchoring in the Solent, the protected waters between the Isle of Wight and the mainland. A relatively safe place to wait for news from Parma, but the relentless English pursuit, the constant skirmishing, forced him to abandon that idea.
So the English essentially herded the Armada further up the channel.
Exactly. They kept the pressure on, denying the Spanish any chance to pause or find refuge. They were being pushed relentlessly eastwards, towards the narrowest part of the channel, towards Calais and the dangerous Flemish coast. Hashtag tag 3.3, the fireships and the Broken Crescent.
So by August 7th, the Armada reaches the waters off Calais. They anchor. But Parma is nowhere near ready.
Parma's army was still miles inland, bogged down by logistics, and crucially, still completely blockaded by those Dutch flyboats. Parma informed Medina Sidonia it would take him at least 6 days to embark his troops, even if the Dutch blockade was lifted.
Which it wasn't. So the Armada is anchored in a vulnerable position, exposed in the Calais roads, waiting for an army that can't reach them.
Utterly vulnerable. Anchored close together in that defensive crescent formation, but in relatively open water. The English commanders saw their chance. They knew they had to break up that formation.
The fireships.
Fireships. A classic, terrifying tactic. The English didn't even wait for specially prepared vessels. They took 8 of their own smaller warships and auxiliaries.
Sacrificed their own ships.
Yes. Packed them with anything flammable, pitch, brimstone, gunpowder, tar set them alight, and steered them downwind on the tide towards the anchored Spanish fleet in the middle of the night.
Just the sight must have been terrifying.
Especially because the Spanish had recent traumatic memories of the Hellburners' purpose-built floating bombs used against them during the siege of Antwerp a few years earlier. They feared these were similar devices packed with explosives.
They panic.
Total panic. In the darkness and confusion, fearing massive explosions, Spanish captains gave the order to cut their anchor cables and get out, scatter, escape the flames.
Did the fireships actually do much damage?
Surprisingly little direct damage. No Spanish ships were actually set ablaze and destroyed by the fireships themselves, but that wasn't the point.
The point was breaking the formation.
Exactly. The crescent was shattered, the fleet was scattered, disorganized, and critically, almost every ship had lost its main anchors.
Why was losing anchors so catastrophic?
Because without anchors, they couldn't easily stop, regroup, or hold position, especially against the wind and currents pushing them northeastwards towards the treacherous sandbanks off the coast of Flanders. They were now adrift, vulnerable, and being driven towards disaster.
So the fireships achieved their aim. The Armada is scattered, anchorless, drifting towards the Flemish shoals. What happens next?
The very next day, August 8th, the English attack again. This is the main engagement, the Battle of Gravelines, fought just off the coast near the border between France and Spanish Flanders.
The Spanish are trying to reform their lines.
Desperately trying. But the English, sensing the kill, close in aggressively. This is where the English tactical advantage really tells.
Maintaining the weather gauge, using their superior maneuverability.
Yes. They keep upwind, circling the now disorganized Spanish ships, pouring cannon fire into their hulls, and rigging at much closer range, now sometimes as close as 100 yards. The Spanish are still trying to close and board, but the English ships are too nimble.
And the difference in gunnery becomes critical here.
Absolutely fatal for the Spanish. English guns could fire faster, maybe 5 or 6 times, for every 1 or 2 shots from the slower to reload Spanish heavy cannons. The English gunners aimed low at the waterline to hold the ships. The Spanish gunners, often soldiers, tended to aim high, trying to sweep the enemy decks clear for boarding, which wasn't going to happen.
So the Spanish ships are taking a real pounding.
A brutal pounding for about 8 hours. Several Spanish ships are badly damaged, drifting, sinking. The large galleass San Lorenzo runs aground near Calais and is looted. 2 big galleons, the San Mateo and San Felipe, are so crippled they drift away and are later captured by the Dutch. At least 3 other ships are sunk or founder during the battle.
Why did the battle stop?
By late afternoon, around 4 p.m., the English were effectively out of ammunition. They'd fired almost everything they had. They were forced to pull back.
But the damage was done.
Irreparably. The Spanish fleet was battered, morale was shattered, and any realistic hope of linking up with Parma was gone. The wind and tide were now relentlessly pushing the surviving ships northwards into the North Sea. There is only one way home now. Hashtag 4.2 Elizabeth's moment of triumph.
While all this is happening at sea back in England, there's still fear of invasion, right? News traveled slowly.
Yes, Parma's army was still intact, even if blockaded. So while the sea battle raged, Elizabeth I makes this incredibly powerful gesture. She travels to West Tilbury in Essex, where a large militia force had been gathered.
This is where she gives that famous speech.
The Tilbury speech, August 18th. It's a masterpiece of rhetoric and leadership. She arrives on horseback wearing a silver breastplate over her gown.
Quite the image.
And delivers these lines that have echoed ever since. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm.
Wow, powerful stuff. What effect did that have?
Immense. It was a huge boost to national morale, a galvanizing moment. It framed the conflict not just as a military struggle, but as a defense of the nation, led by a queen willing to fight alongside her people. It cemented her legendary status, regardless of the final outcome at sea, which wasn't fully known yet. Hashtag 4.3, the long journey home.
Okay, so back to the Armada. The English break off pursuit somewhere off Scotland, near the Firth of Forth. The Spanish are heading north. What route do they have to take?
The only option left is the long, dangerous passage north around Scotland, then south through the Atlantic, past the west coast of Ireland, and hopefully back to Spain. About 110 ships were still with the main fleet, but they were damaged, leaking, low on food and water, crews exhausted and sick.
And they're sailing into notoriously treacherous waters.
Some of the worst in the world. And this is where the weather, God's winds and waves, as Philip later put it, really finished the job. They faced a combination of factors.
Navigation errors.
Big time. They were skilled at latitude sailing, but calculating longitude accurately was basically impossible then. They consistently underestimated how far west the Irish coast was. Plus, the Gulf Stream and North Atlantic drift currents were pushing them further north and east than they realized.
And the weather itself.
Unusually severe storms swept in. We know this period was part of the Little Ice Age with more extreme weather events. These battered the already weakened ships.
Ships that had lost their anchors at Calais.
Crucially, yes. So when they were driven towards the rocky lee shores of Scotland and especially Ireland, they had no way to stop themselves from being smashed onto the rocks.
The descriptions of the shipwrecks off Ireland are horrific.
Truly harrowing. At least 28 ships are known to have been wrecked along that coast. Thousands of men drowned. Those who made it ashore were often starving, freezing, sick with dysentery or typhus.
And they faced hostility ashore.
Often, yes. Some local Irish lords offered help, but many areas were controlled by English garrisons or allied Irish clans. English policy was basically to kill any Spanish survivors found. The custom of ransoming highborn prisoners was largely ignored. Around 5,000 men are thought to have died just on the Irish coast, drowned, starved, or killed.
So the fleet that eventually limps back to Spain is a shadow of what set out.
A ghost fleet. Perhaps 44, maybe as many as 51 ships lost in total from the 137 that left Coruña. They straggled back into Spanish ports like Santander and Coruña over September and October 1588, battered, diseased, bringing news of utter disaster.
So the survivors return. How was the news received in Spain? Was there an immediate understanding of the scale of the defeat?
Not immediately. Philip's agents had initially spread rumors of a great victory across Europe, partly to try and convince the Pope to release that promised subsidy. Reliable news of the disaster only really started filtering back in late August, and the true scale became apparent as the wrecked ships returned in September.
The sight of those returning ships must have been devastating.
Appalling. Medina Sidonia's own flagship, the San Martin, barely made it back. Many ships that did return were so damaged they were immediately condemned as unseaworthy, just broken up or scuttled.
And the human cost. You mentioned the ship losses, but the men.
Staggering. We have figures suggesting around 25,000 to 26,000 men sailed from Coruña on the final leg. Only about 13,000 to 14,000 ever returned. That's a loss rate approaching 50%.
Over 11,000 men lost.
At least. And many who did survive the voyage died soon after reaching Spain from diseases like typhus and scurvy contracted aboard the filthy, overcrowded ships. Even senior commanders like Recalde and Oquendo died within weeks of returning.
How did Philip II react personally to this catastrophe?
Publicly, with stoicism and piety. He famously is reported to have said something like, "I sent the Armada against men, not God's winds and waves." He took the blame administratively, but framed the ultimate failure as an act of God beyond human control. Tag 5.2, England's propaganda and geopolitical shift.
Meanwhile, in England, celebrations.
Huge celebrations. It was hailed as a miraculous deliverance, proof of God's favor for the Protestant cause. Thanksgiving services were held, captured Spanish flags were paraded through London and displayed in St. Paul's Cathedral.
And this is where the myth-making really takes off.
Absolutely. The victory became central to England's national story. A massive propaganda effort kicked in. Commemorative medals were struck with the Latin inscription, Flavit Jehovah et dissipati sunt. God blew, and they were scattered.
Attributing the victory to divine intervention rather than, say, English naval skill or Spanish incompetence.
Largely, yes, though English naval prowess was certainly celebrated too, but the Protestant Wind narrative was powerful and enduring.
Beyond the propaganda, though, what were the real strategic takeaways? Did this mark a fundamental shift?
I think it did, particularly in naval warfare. It massively validated the English focus on maneuverability, on those race-built galleons, and crucially, on gunnery overboarding.
Standing off and pounding the enemy with cannons.
Exactly. The Armada's failure showed the limitations of the traditional Spanish model, slow, high-castled ships packed with soldiers meant for boarding. The future, it seemed, belonged to the faster, more heavily gunned English-style warship. It was a tactical revolution confirmed in battle. Tag 5.3, the war continues. Into part 2.
So a decisive victory for England, a catastrophe for Spain. Did it end the war?
Absolutely not. That's a crucial point often missed. The Armada's failure prevented the invasion of England in 1588, which was strategically decisive for that campaign. But the wider Anglo-Spanish War dragged on for another 15 years, until 1604.
And did Spain just give up on naval power?
Far from it. Philip II, despite the cost, immediately began rebuilding his navy, learning lessons from the defeat. Spanish naval power actually recovered remarkably quickly in the 1590s, adopting some of the English innovations.
And England, did they press their advantage?
They tried, but perhaps got overconfident. The very next year, 1589, Elizabeth launched her own massive naval expedition, the English Armada, or Counter-Armada.
Led by Drake again. What was the plan?
Drake and Sir John Norris were in command. The aims were ambitious. Destroy the surviving Spanish Armada ships being repaired in northern Spain, stir up a revolt in Portugal against Philip, and maybe capture the Azores treasure fleet.
How did that go?
It was a disaster for the English. They failed on all counts. Poor planning, disease, determined Spanish resistance. The English lost possibly even more men than the Spanish had in 1588. Estimates range from 11,000 to 15,000 casualties, and it cost the English treasury dearly.
So the immediate aftermath wasn't England triumphant, Spain crushed.
Not at all. Spain suffered a major blow to its prestige and finances, yes, but it remained the dominant European power. The English failure in 1589 showed the war was far from over, and that mounting large-scale amphibious operations was incredibly difficult and costly for either side.
So the Armada's defeat was a pivotal moment. It changed naval thinking, but it wasn't the end of the story.
Not by a long shot. It set the stage for another decade and a half of conflict, shifting strategies, and continued rivalry across the globe.
Which raises the question, what deeper lessons were learned, or perhaps ignored, by both sides after 1588? How did this clash shape the future of naval power and colonial ambitions?
That's exactly where we'll pick up in part 2. We'll look at the continuing war, the legacy of the Armada myth, and the long-term impact on naval technology and global power dynamics.
Fantastic. We'll leave it there for now. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the gathering storm of the Spanish Armada.